2010-57 and 2011-13. In the triennial review, this amendment is categorized as a high priority. This amendment further supports the Marine Managed Areas Improvement Act, which aimed to establish consistency among state agencies for marine managed areas. This act classified 3 types of marine managed areas. 1 are the state water quality protection areas, and 3 are MPAs. Take and MPAs is regulated by Fish and Game and state parks. To be clear, this amendment does not designate any new state water quality protection areas. Designation of an area would occur in a separate public process as described in Appendix A of the Ocean Plan. This amendment does establish a framework for intermediate level of water quality protection upon designated state marine parks and state marine conservation areas, called State Water Quality Protection Areas of General Protection. General protection areas will be stricter than the baseline ocean plan and less strict than an ASBS. For designated general protection areas, current point and non-point source discharges and seawater intakes that don't undesirably alter natural water quality will be allowed. There will be restrictions on new point and non-point source discharges and new seawater intakes. To further explain the framework for general protection areas, here's a map with 3 different examples illustrated. To orient yourselves towards the map, the blue areas are ASBSs, the purple areas are MPAs, and the red dots are NPDS ocean outfalls. In the first example, there are 2 MPAs, a state marine conservation area, and a state marine reserve, co-located with an ASBS. A general protection area would not be designated here since the ASBS provides significant protections to the 2 MPAs. In the second example, there are again 2 MPAs, a state marine park and a state marine conservation area. There is a wastewater outfall near but not within these areas. This is a potential area where general protection areas could be designated if there is scientific evidence of impairments of beneficial use. And finally, in the third example, there's a state marine conservation area designated in the enclosed bay. Since the ocean plan is not applicable to enclosed bays and estuaries, a general protection area could not be established there. So finally, our staff recommendation is to adopt the resolution and approve the amendment and the substitute environmental document. Additionally, I just wanted to take the time to say thank you to Chair Hopman, board members, Tom Howard, Jonathan Bishop, Dominic Gregorio, Mariela Carpio-Basis, and other great staff. This amendment has been one of my main projects for my Sea Grant Fellowship at the State Water Board, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to move it through the public process. I'm extremely appreciative of this experience and have learned a lot about making collaborative and science-based policy and management decisions to protect our water and ocean resources. So thank you.
So if we don't
Now,
approve it, you're going to be pretty disappointed, huh, Joanna?
A little bit.
Is that what you're telling us?
The pressure's on.
Any questions of staff before we take public comments? Grace Chan. I'm told this is your first time here. Welcome.
Thank you.
We'll be nice on you the first time, okay? Or we'll try.
Good afternoon, Chair Hoppen and board members. My name is Grace Chan. I'm the Chief Engineer and General Manager of the Sanitation Districts of Los Angeles County. And I'm here to express our overall support for the amendments in your package. I do have one requested revision, which I'll get to in a moment, but I wanted to just very briefly speak to the context leading up to that request. We serve the wastewater management needs of about 5 million people in metropolitan Los Angeles County. The terminal treatment plant in that system discharges 300 million gallons per day through a deep ocean outfall off the south coast of the Palos Verdes Peninsula. With regard to the MPA designation process, we actively participated in that all along and consistently expressed our concerns that the MPAs that were ultimately designated off the coast of PV are concerned that those designations would lead to either new requirements on our outfalls or modified, more stringent requirements. And that was a particular concern to us given the fact that the habitat quality was low, and they are in fact in a Superfund site. The board addressed our concern in November 2010 and adopted a resolution that in part indicated that no new or modified limits or conditions would be imposed on existing outfalls based on the MPA designation. And while an earlier draft, the one in the early part of the year, we felt had language that was consistent with the resolution, it's since been modified. And specifically in section 7.1E2, the proposed amendments say that MPAs may not be the sole basis, sole being emphasized there, for new limits on existing outfalls. We see this as a very specific amendment that does modify the section to make it inconsistent with the intent of the resolution, and so therefore we would respectfully request that the word sole be removed from the proposed language. Alternatively to that, we do have other language that we can put in, but that's what we can suggest, but that's the simplest fix for us. And I did want to close by thanking the board members and the staff for all of their efforts in this process. We know it's not been easy. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Jonathan,
Actually, I'm sorry, before Ms. Chan, could you come back up? I just want to get a clarification with respect to your concern of, well, let me go back. Your understanding of the board's intent in adopting the previous resolution was that the MAP designation would not by itself lead to additional requirements on existing discharge. Is that not correct?
That's one case, but also that it would not be justification for more stringent requirements that arise from other conditions.
Okay,
So
the designation of MAP.
that's right. So,
Okay,
so
MPA. MPA, sorry.
So in our mind, the existing language just speaks to one scenario, not the scenario where there would be additional regulation based on the MPA designation
But
on
should,
top of other reasons.
but should evidence come to light that show, you know, some other causes of concerns that may lead to additional requirements, that's a different scenario, and that does not have to do with the designation. The county is not opposed to those additional requirements.
We would, we certainly accept being regulated by the ocean plan and our permit limits, and to the extent that anything came up with regard to our violation of those requirements, we would be concerned that the existing language in these amendments could be an additional reason for making new requirements more stringent.
Okay. Thank you. That actually is very helpful, and obviously I'm sure there will be other commenters, but let me ask staff to start thinking about, I would consider removing the word soul, since it seemed to be such an angst here. If we were to add to the resolution, perhaps in the whereas section, a statement that reflects what was just discussed here between me and Ms. Chan, that should evidence come to light that shows concerns that necessitate additional, more stringent requirements to protect, to achieve the water quality objectives and protect marine ecosystem, then obviously the regional boards and others should feel confident that they're able to do that and are not limited by the language of this current amendment to the policy. So I'll come back to staff, and also I obviously want to hear from other commenters as well, but if staff can start thinking about that.
I was going to make essentially the same suggestion, because when I asked you the question, Jonathan, I was I had comfort in your answer. I thought the parties that were there at the time did. I suspect we're going to hear the other side of the soul train here in a moment, if you will. And so let's be prepared to give the explanation that you gave that satisfied me the other day, and possibly the language that, or certainly the language that Tim was talking about, so we have it in case it's necessary. Phil, do you feel necessary to come up, or? Okay. We'll start the Sarah and Joe tag team with Ms. Amazeda.
Good afternoon again, board members. Sarah Amanzada on behalf of the California Coastkeeper Alliance. Although our groups were initially opposed to the development of this ocean plan amendment as unnecessary beyond the resolution that this board adopted, we have worked closely with staff over the past year and a half to develop an amendment that provides a workable framework for water quality protection in state water quality protected areas. We've shared with staff some of our remaining concerns over provisions that may be unclear in the September 26 draft, but notwithstanding these concerns, I can support this board's adoption of this resolution today if two issues are resolved. And the primary issue being that the board retain the sole basis language in provision 2. The reason is that the proposed amendment merely establishes a framework for future designation of state water quality protected areas and water quality protections associated with MPAs. These areas and regulations are not established through this amendment. LA County Sanitation will have an opportunity in the future to make a detailed case for why certain MPAs may or may not be good candidates for additional water quality protections. I find it extremely problematic and concerning to create an entire state policy around one discharger's concern about one outfall and one MPA. I think it's a really bad precedent to set, and I think it's totally unnecessary. And from a process standpoint, it's very frustrating and concerning to have this major amendment introduced, sort of in the back channels at the last minute before we're going to be adopting this policy when we've been working on it for a year and a half. So I strongly urge the board to move forward with the language in this amendment as is. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah? No, Sikich. If I start calling you 1 and 2, somebody's going to be disheartened that they're number 2, so I'll just keep trying to confuse you. How's that?
Funny. Sarah number 2, Sarah Sikich here from Heal the Bay. I'm the Coastal Resources Director there. We maybe need little signs that say 1 and 2, Sarah's. I was deeply involved in the Marine Life Protection Act process in Southern California. I was a member of the stakeholder group, which for over 2 years negotiated where these marine protected areas would be and got them to the point where they actually were designated and put into effect. And we have over 50 marine protected areas just in the South Coast alone. Obviously, there's more up in the North Central Coast and the North Coast. We've now got an entire statewide network of marine protected areas except for in the San Francisco Bay. And I'm very proud of how many of these areas turned out to be in spots which have high conservation value. But as with any negotiation, there were some spots that were, less important from a conservation standpoint, but still important to achieve a network effect of these marine protected areas. And Palos Verdes happens to be one of those. It's got less quality habitat than somewhere like Point Dume or La Jolla, but it's still got rocky reef and some kelp, and water quality was a major part of the conversations, not just in PV, but for the entire statewide network of MPAs. It was really important to many of the fishing stakeholders that water quality be protected down the line in some of these areas because they felt like they were having the sole burden of losing the opportunity to fish. But if we were going to achieve holistic ecosystem protection, water quality must be thought of and addressed appropriately in these areas. I understand Los Angeles County Sanitation's concerns, and I feel like they were worked out through many steps along this process. First of all, the Point Vicente State Marine Reserve was downgraded from a marine reserve to a conservation area at the fish and game level because they wanted to be able to retain their monitoring efforts, which is important, and we were, not really excited about seeing a reserve downgradation, but we understood the reasons. And then the state board adopted Resolution 2010-57, which set up this ocean plan amendment process. And as Sarah said, it wasn't something we were very supportive of, but we understand that we're in this position now. And so I just want to mention that it's important to remember that the proposed ocean plan amendment today simply establishes a framework for future designation of state water quality protected areas and water quality protections associated with these MPAs. It doesn't establish these areas or new regulations. If such proposals were made in the future for PV, there would be the opportunity to justify why the MPAs in Palos Verdes may or may not be good candidates for additional water quality protections. There's over a dozen state marine parks and conservation areas along the coast that are in the vicinity of a wastewater outfall. And creating exception for a single stakeholder that affects the entire framework for the entire network of MPAs just seems like it's a little heavy-handed at this standpoint. So I do support the inclusion of sole basis in provision E2. I think it needs to be there and needs to be retained so that the State Water Board have the ability in the future to regulate wastewater discharge if necessary. We understand that LA County Sanitation is concerned and that the PV MPAs have lower quality habitat and there are legacy contaminant issues here, but it's state board process to adopt policies and regulations based on the best available science. So if a water quality protected area or newer modified water quality regulations were to be proposed for this site in the future, those habitat and contaminated sediment issues would have to be taken into account during that process. And if a state water quality protected area or newer modified regulations were adopted associated with that area, evaluation would also have to take that into account. And we believe those are valid points, but it's just, that's made to be happening at a future discussion. If the sole basis language is removed, we fear that this provision would state that an SMP, the marine park or conservation area, wouldn't be reason at all for modified limits, and they may be merited. It sort of discredits the fact that these are ecologically important areas, and that's something that the conservation community is concerned about, especially after putting so much effort towards designating these in the first place. So I support the comments as made before me by Sarah, and welcome any questions if you have them. Thank you.
Let me follow up. Sarah, please stay. I'm just trying to make sure I understand your and the other Sarah's concern with respect to the word soul now. Is it correct to say that your support of keeping the word soul is to ensure that the water boards, including state and regional, maintain our authority to require additional measures through, NPDES permits and other venues as necessary to protect these areas should information come to light that a certain discharge is contributing to its impairment or contributing to an exceedance of water quality objectives? That is your purpose in maintaining the word soul is to ensure that we retain that authority.
That is correct, and we saw SOL as a compromise because we understood that LA County Sanitation didn't want an arbitrary regulation or limit to come down because simply there's a protected area there, but there had to be acknowledgement that there's a special area, an ecologically special area here, and that water boards in the future, have the right to regulate if it's merited.
I think we would definitely agree with that, and again, I will look to staff to draft some language to propose that would make it very clear that we retain those authorities and those right to require additional measures in NPDES permits as necessary should a discharge be shown to contribute to an impairment or an exceedance of water quality objectives, regardless of their designation.
I appreciate that.
Okay.
Wait, wouldn't the alternate, am I interrupting? I'm looking to the chair.
I didn't hear you.
Oh, okay. Is it preferable to you to do comfort language by taking soul out and putting language in versus keeping soul in and then giving LA County sand comfort elsewhere. That seems simpler.
I honestly don't know that. When I asked Jonathan this question the other day, independent of having been approached in a briefing by either LA Sand or the environmental community, that word struck me as well. So if we can accomplish what Ms. Stoddard just articulated, I don't care whether the word stays in there or not. I think it's a matter of clarity, quite frankly. So that's my,
All right, so either way.
I just need the clarity. And I, like I said, John's credit, he clarified it to me the other day, which, as you know, is awfully difficult to do at times. So. Mr. Geaver.
Thank you, Chair and board members. So I'm Joe Geaver. I'm the Water Programs Manager for Surfrider Foundation. And just as a little background, look, designating these MPAs was not an easy process. It was really contentious and painful for a lot of us. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of fishermen felt like MPAs were unnecessary and that we don't need them at all. And a lot of enviros probably felt that what we ended up with was way too small of an area. I was raised a commercial fisherman and now I work for an environmental group. I'll tell you, it was particularly painful for me. But the one thing that came out of this process that I think everybody agreed on was that if you don't protect water quality in these areas, then you're not going to get the full benefit of restored ecosystem benefits. You have to do water quality protection along with prohibiting fishing. I would, I have some written comments, but I'm going to go off a little bit. Frankly, I would, if I were king, every MPA would just automatically have a water quality protection area designated over it. It just seems like it comes with the territory. But LA County Sand has raised an interesting sort of set of circumstances that I agree deserve more debate, right? Whether a water quality protection area is actually going to be beneficial there, whether it's appropriate to change the regulations on the discharge because of the water quality. That's all, I think they've raised important issues that are debatable. I think what's missing from this discussion so far is that it's not just, it doesn't just hang on this clause of sole basis for designating a water quality protection area. It hangs on the designation process as well. When we've known from the beginning, as a matter of fact, I wrote this book about this process a decade ago, that when you want a water quality protection area, you're going to have to walk in and petition for it. And it's not going to be an easy process. It's going to be a demanding process. And there's going to be opposition to it. We knew that from the beginning. That demanding process is the appropriate place for the argument that LA County Sand is making to you, right? That designation process is where they can come in and say, look, there's a lot of polluted sediment, it's really crappy habitat, it was the wrong place to put an MPA. That's all valid arguments for that one site. But you don't change statewide guidelines for one specific site. You use the process that's available for making your case. So I think, honing in on this kind of silly clause, call it whatever you want, sole, only, whatever. The notion is that, and this was a compromise, and a compromise that, I'm not all that comfortable with, that yeah, maybe not every MPA should have a water quality protection area, and the way you get there is by saying, the fact that there's an MPA here isn't the only reason you designate a water quality protection area. You got to do more, and you got to do more in the petition process. That's how I think that they're guaranteed against the concerns that they've raised. But I think I want to add some comments too about provision 5A3. I don't know if you have it in front of you, but this is really, in some ways, more concerning for me, and it goes to what the directions in the MMAIA actually say. And if you read, I know you don't have this in front of you, so I'll read this to you. This is section 36.710, subsection F, says, in a state water quality protection area, point source waste and thermal discharges shall be prohibited or limited by special conditions. Non-point source shall be controlled to the extent practicable. Look, it was considered, the legislature considered this, that it may well, you may well have to put special limitations on point source discharges when you designate a water quality protection area. So separate from the question of where these things should go is what you can do when you designate them, right? And this provision that you have in here, this 5A3, actually counters that. It's in contradiction of that. It states that you actually can't do that. I think you got a legal problem there, and I'd be really curious to hear the staff's response to that, because this is contradictory language. So anyway, I think I've gone over my time, but so I'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Would staff like to comment to Joe's points on the legality of all this?
I guess I'll just hit that very briefly. I mean, as I look back at what is in the Public Resources Code, there was a generic statement that Mr. Giever alluded to, and it's an important statement about the component of MPAs and how they'll interface in the protections that are expected. However, you know, this board, and I think it's, Mr. Giever had some important points about, and I'm going to colloquially say, you know, the tail wagging the dog with respect to a specific site creating a broad exception that applies statewide. But in many respects, I see that being the same thing in converse here. You have a situation where there is a broad pronouncement in the Public Resources Code, but what the board is trying to deal with is the fact that we have significant investments in infrastructure and a highly treated wastewater outfall that has been there for a long time in a generally degraded area. And as a result, this board decided to create a relatively narrow exception, and that exception happens to apply statewide, although I'm not aware of anybody else that actually can take advantage of it. And so I think it's entirely appropriate and consistent with the marine protected area requirements and limitations and the special implementation language that's being included in Section 5 to allow these types of carve-outs that would recognize that you can have an existing wastewater discharge outfall within a marine protected area, and that we do not anticipate that based solely upon the designation that you would go ahead and put in place additional restrictions. You know, at the same time, there are other provisions of the ocean plan and other provisions of the water code that may require those additional restrictions over time, and that's the finding that Board Member Doduk has alluded to.
Thank you. Phil, you want a cut at this now?
Phil Freeze, Tech Services Department, head with the sanitation districts. If I could just make a very brief couple of follow-on remarks at this point. I think the provision that we're debating right now isn't about water quality protection areas and our ability to challenge formation of water quality protection areas or the conditions that would be brought by water quality protection areas. It's a provision that goes to the authority of permit writers to establish new conditions in our NPDES permits. And so we could have new conditions placed in our permits even without the establishment of a water quality protection area. We are concerned about that, and I would say that even when we have thought we had very good arguments about new conditions in our permits, we haven't always prevailed. So I really appreciate the arguments the environmental community's made that it seems like blunt force and wrong to do things for one discharger when it's a statewide issue. I really get that, and we don't mean to seem paranoid, but we have failed to prevail even when we have thought we had really good arguments in the past. The only other point I wanted to make is there are 52 marine protected areas in the South Coast Study Region. One of the Sarah Sickett, said that there are about a dozen in the vicinity of outfalls. I guess it depends on how you define vicinity. I think we feel like there are 5 intermediates within a mile of an 5 intermediate outfalls within a mile of an MPA, and 2 major outfalls within 2 miles of an MPA. We really think when they designated those MPAs, they should have avoided the outfalls, and then we wouldn't be facing these kinds of issues. When they designate MPAs near existing outfalls, the POTW community would argue that you ought to accept at that point the protections offered by the ocean plan with regard to water quality in the MPAs. We think the ocean plan, the baseline ocean plan, does protect water quality, and the ocean plan can always be made more stringent with time, and we recognize we'll always have the obligation to meet more and more stringent ocean plan requirements with time. If we ever cause or contribute to violation of ocean plan requirements, we understand it's always our obligation to take whatever actions to meet those requirements and to have new conditions placed on us so we meet those requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Mr. Lucas. And we don't have any underground faults out there, or vaults.
You're prescient. Actually, that's the primary thrust of why I'm here today. We're concerned that we might. Bob Lucas, representing the California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance, primarily those utility members that provide heat, cooling, power, communication services throughout the state. As we found in consideration of the MS4 Caltrans permit, there is a real concern about how do we make this finding that would allow MPDES permitted discharges to MS4s that discharge to these areas allowable without having to go through a myriad of different permits. We found a solution with regard to vaults because the vault permit is a general permit of this board, and there was enough confidence by the staff to make that finding for vaults. However, we still have a quandary of what to do about the other MS4s, or excuse me, about the other NPDES permits that actually are administered by the regions for things such as hydrostatic testing or construction dewatering, for example. These are short-term, intermittent types of discharges that just by their very nature and the fact that they're already controlled under an NPDES permit are going to have minimal, if any, significant impact to the receiving water body. So our concern here today is, are we unintentionally capturing these new intermediate concerned areas and imposing the same types of issues back onto the utilities for how do we discharge to necessary discharges to MS4s that discharge into these areas. I'm not familiar with the exact language I was referred to a little bit earlier of 5C2. If that's a finding, by the way, that that authorizes MPDES permitted non-stormwater discharges in this particular ocean plan amendment, then I think our issues are okay. We're not adding a new burden to the utilities and to go back to all of the myriad of permits out there to have this one finding inserted in each one of these permits. If it isn't, then I would like to respectfully request that we find a way to put that finding into this ocean plan so that we don't have these other problems as we did with the ASBS discharges, with all of these other new designations that are actually cover a lot more area up and down the coast, particularly around the urban environments. So it's a very real issue. When the utilities need to get into these vaults, for example, it's important that they not be inhibited by arbitrary restrictions that prohibit their ability to evacuate them, for example. Now, we did have a conversation yesterday with Mr. Laufer about the ASBS situation. I'm not sure if he's been able to give it further thought as to the implications of these new water quality protection areas that we're talking about here for the general plan, but I'd be curious to hear if he thinks that there is a solution for this, if I may ask.
Okay. The provision that is in the draft, our staff's draft proposal that is before you, is largely mirrored off the special protection provisions that were in the ASBSs. However, it's important to recognize, as you heard the description by staff earlier today, that the stormwater quality, or water quality protection areas, the GP category, has a lesser degree of protection than the ASBSs. So as you look at this, it is largely like the ASBS requirements in the sense that there has to be some sort of predicate finding. That finding has actually already been made, if you will, for the vault permits. But the requirements are not as stringent that there can be no degradation of natural water quality. Instead, if you look at the language that's on page 22 of the staff proposal in 5C1, there's a further explanation of how the degradation of natural water quality comes into play for what I'm going to refer to as lesser protections that we're affording to the stormwater, or the SWQPA's GPs. And those are that you have to refer back to the Table 1 constituents in the ocean plan. And what that will allow is a lower threshold, if you will, for these types of discharges to be authorized on a going forward basis. Now, the conversation that I had with Mr. Lucas yesterday is a conversation that Mr. Bishop has had with other stakeholders over the course of the last month or so, is that in time we see the state board potentially moving to roll up a lot of these sort of disparate general permits that were referenced, hydrostatic testing, for example, into a statewide permit, so that we're not doing this on a case-by-case basis in each region, because the issues are fairly common, and especially in terms of how they implicate marine protected areas and ASBSs, they're common across these activities. So we're looking for a path forward that makes it a little bit easier, but in time we're recognizing that these areas require some special protections, and that we're putting a higher evidentiary threshold than just simply saying the discharges, if they're authorized by an MPDS permit, are permitted, because we didn't want to put the municipal permittees in a catch-22 where the state board is saying that these other non-stormwater discharges are authorized, but it then potentially puts the municipality in non-compliance with any special protections the state board is implying. So.
Unfortunately, it's liable to put the utility into non-compliance unless they're able to go back to each and every one of these permits and make whatever changes necessary so that the permit recognizes the changes that you're considering today. Could you consider some type of a temporary finding that will carry us over to the point in time when we are able to roll these other permits up into state permits? Just so that the utilities don't face a wall of having to go back to all of these permitting entities for a specific finding in each one of these permits.
Is there a way, Michael, we can deal with this in the interim until we have a policy that will deal with
Well, the reality is that if the board were to adopt this today and it were to take effect, it's not self-implementing. Those municipal permits, for example, and in this particular case we have the Phase 2 permit that's coming up before this board very shortly, are the vehicles in which some of the special protection language becomes implemented. And it's only at that point in time that you make the findings, and it's only at that point in time that, if you will, the utility companies could potentially come in jeopardy. But it's at least 2 or 3 steps away, and along the way is when the regional board, or in some instances the state board, is making the necessary findings that will allow the municipalities to go forward and receive the discharges from the utilities. Yeah. So part of the issue, and this is something that your staff worked mightily on with the Caltrans permit, was we're concerned about the impacts that these discharges can have. As we get the information, we're prepared to authorize them, but until we actually have some information before us and consider them in an appropriate fashion, staff are uncomfortable making a technical finding that they are not going to cause the kind of jeopardy to the municipalities that we're trying to address through the specific language that is in 5C2.
Unfortunately, it's only through the adoption of this ocean plan amendment that all of these other areas now come into play in the same way as the ASBS. So it is an enlargement.
Yeah, I actually don't think that's quite right, Mr. Lucas. I think what we're doing here is we're setting up the criteria for how state water quality protection areas are going to be implemented, or designated and then implemented. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's not a single SWQPA designated in the state of California at this time. So what we're doing is we're laying the groundwork for the rule book on intermediate protection. it looks pretty reasonable to me. You know, that this, based on Mr. Laufer's description, yes, these utility discharges can definitely have an impact. And so in an intermediate level protection area, we're not going to compromise on the language to protect from those significant potential impacts. So we can talk about the timeline as far as, you know, how this gets implemented in general permits. That's a valid discussion. But at this point, since we don't have any designated areas, there is not an immediate implementation impact today.
Okay, and I don't mean to be argumentative, but I would like to point out one other item here that you might be interested in. There is a definition for the receiving water quality for state marine reserves in statute. And that says to be maintained to the extent practicable in an undisturbed and unpolluted state. Now, my understanding of this, and maybe that's wrong, is that the new definition would be marine species or biological communities are protected from undesirable alteration in natural water quality, which is a more stringent definition of receiving water quality than is in the statute. And I don't know how you want to deal with that, but just want to point that out to you, that there is an inconsistency here in that. And also, I'd be happy to sit down and work with your policy staff and work with your legal staff on this. It's going to come up again when we do the small MS4s. I'm going to be up here again making the same issues. It would be nice before that time if we can figure out some way to deal with this in aggregate. So, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bob. Mr. Laufer, Mr. Bishop, Ms. Doduk spoke to you about some language, I believe.
And let me just add that I think, regardless of what the board decide to do with respect to keeping or removing the word soul, I think I've heard enough from so many stakeholders on this issue that I think it merits clarification somewhere that the board retains our authority to require additional measures in permits should it be demonstrated that the discharge is having an impact. And so with that, could you, whomever,
So-
Marley?
Yeah.
Before we jump to the language,
Okay.
I think it's important to understand from the staff's point of view, we do not believe that this amendment curtails our ability in any way to address impairments of beneficial uses in the ocean. The point of this amendment was to say that we were not going to use the designation of an MPA to impose further restrictions on an ocean outfall all by itself. So putting the word soul in or not has no impact on what we feel is our authority. Now you can ask Michael or Marley if they agree with my interpretation of our authority.
That has been my interpretation as well, because the central issue is the water quality data, and that is what staff has maintained all along would be the important issue. So to attempt to address your concern, I have drafted a new whereas for potential insertion into the resolution, and it would go like this. The ocean plan is clear that there shall not be degradation of marine communities or other exceedances of water quality objectives due to waste discharges. This is true for all near coastal ocean waters, regardless of whether a marine protected area is present. If sound scientific information becomes available demonstrating that discharges are causing or contributing to the degradation of marine communities, or causing or contributing to the exceedance of narrative or numeric water quality objectives, then new or modified limitations or conditions may be placed in the NPDES permit to provide protections for marine life both inside and outside of marine protected areas.
Thank you.
I actually, could I ask Sarah to come up and because I saw you saying no. And you know, it can't be, please don't say it's because I love the word soul. Please don't say that. What is, what is the damage you see that will be done by using what is our authority to protect water quality both inside and outside an MPA?
So I will make you happy in that I'm going to say it's not because I love the word soul. Like Joe, if there was some, clarification that MPAs wouldn't arbitrarily only be used, because they're designated to cause for future regulation on dischargers, that was, what we were talking about, the intent of the word soul. I think, and again, I'm just hearing this for the first time, so I'm trying to digest it. I think the part that made me concerned was that if it's in a whereas clause, I don't know how binding it is in terms of the ocean plan amendment itself. Because if you take the word soul out of provision E2, it says the designation of state marine parks and state marine conservation areas may not serve as the basis for new or modified limitations, substantive conditions, or prohibitions upon existing municipal point source wastewater discharge outfalls. So I'm concerned that in the future, potentially staff or a board could say, well, we can't do this because there's MPAs there. So it sounds like there's a difference of opinion from the legal staff, and I am not a lawyer, but I think it would be more comforting from a policy perspective if that language, the type of language that was introduced, was actually in the proposed amendment rather than in the whereas clause.
You address that, Mr. Loffer? I've always felt that if we put a whereas, it was basically an addendum to what we had previously, and it is binding.
Well, I guess I see two parts of it. I mean, the whereas clause, and I think Ms. Wood indicated would be indicated or inserted as new whereas clause number 8 in the resolution, certainly underscores this board's understanding and underlines what the law is with respect to ocean plan protections and how the water boards, both the state board and the regional boards, are to implement the ocean plan. In this particular case, I mean, putting that extra language into the actual policy or into the actual ocean plan wouldn't really add anything because it's not regulatory in nature. It's underscoring what the law is. And I think part of the disconnect is I hear commenters from the conservation community talk about this issue is, and I recognize it's important to them, and I think as I look back, I was pulling back up the original resolution from a year ago or 2 years ago when we dealt with this issue. You know, we did not have the word soul there, but the purpose was clear that it would be the act of designation itself that would not result in these additional restrictions. And I think what's getting lost in some of the dialogue here is what does soul modify? And it's not the marine protected areas aren't going to be the sole basis, it's the designation, and that's the key modifier, or that's what's modified by soul. And so taking that word out and just saying that the designation will not result in additional, or will not be the basis of restrictions, doesn't diminish the board's authority in any way. And I think the resolved clause that Ms. Dodek has requested helps underscore once again that we have an affirmative obligation to protect in the near coastal zone, regardless of whether it's an MPA. So, you know, from my perspective, you know, I understand the concerns on both sides. Semantics are important, but in this particular case, I think that if the word soul was to be stricken, it would hew pretty closely to what we had in the original resolution, and with the additional finding, it would completely underscore the purpose of the actual special protections here.
Yeah. All right, but can you help me understand another thing? I mean, it sounds like what we're not trying to say that marine protected areas are chopped liver and irrelevant to what we do. I think we need to be able to acknowledge something that's took a lot of time and has been done at the state level, but we need to play our own role. So when I read sole basis, and I read it a bunch of times because so many people were concerned about it, I thought that the argument saying that we're making a big change based on a concern we have about the LA County sand situation, it made more sense to me to keep sole basis as opposed to saying shall not be the basis, because we would want to acknowledge them. And I understand that you're saying that the language we're talking about, even with or without, we would have the ability to acknowledge it. So I would want, when I'm not thinking, let's take LA County sand out of it, and I do understand the need for comfort, and I'm open to any way to give them comfort, I'm uncomfortable with saying that the fact that it's been designated shouldn't be the basis of anything because we just went through this whole process. So that sounds even, I know it works either way. I mean, the fact actually that on a lot of these issues we're angels dancing on the head of a pin, I think is a tribute to the good job the staff did and the process you all went through, because we would be arguing about much bigger things if you hadn't done such a good job. But I'm just concerned that anything we do, I don't want it to sound like we think that the marine protected areas aren't important, which is the impression one could get if you weren't in the weeds with what we were trying to deal with. So that's why I was thinking if there's a way to give comfort to County San of some measure while retaining our authority versus taking the word soul out, I feel more comfortable keeping the word soul in and then doing the comfort language.
Well, I believe LA County actually proposed a footnote, and maybe as an attorney you would appreciate the proposed language. I think I told Phil that it was quite difficult to follow. Were those suggested language part of the record? I don't remember.
No.
Okay. Not then. Phil, do you want to come up and read that language? And maybe Felicia would be better able to understand it?
Your PDF expert won't
open. We're trying to, with this footnote, show that we weren't trying to have the MPA in any way shield us from regulation from all other causes for regulation, but we were trying to make it clear that the MPA shouldn't drive new regulations of our discharge. So my language says the designation of state marine parks and state marine conservation areas will not serve to limit imposition of or to make more stringent any new or modified limitations, substantive conditions, or prohibitions that may be imposed upon existing municipal point source wastewater discharge outfalls as may be required by the California Ocean Plan in effect as of the effective date of this amendment or any future amendments thereto or by any other regulations that apply to existing municipal point source wastewater discharge outfalls. However, the designation of state marine parks or state marine conservation areas in the vicinity of existing municipal point source wastewater discharge outfalls will not serve as the basis for such new or modified limitations, substantive conditions, or prohibitions in the absence of violation of ocean plan requirements or of the requirements of other applicable regulations. So that second, it is a long, ponderous. But I'm trying to say that if you put an MPA next to an outfall, it shouldn't create a new standard for the outfall. You should have avoided the outfall when you designated the MPA.
Maybe yes, maybe no.
Yeah.
Because I was very involved in that process. You're looking for what the fish need, and that is a part of what we take.
Yeah,
So I think you're on overkill on this.
I
get why you're concerned about it, but this is overkill in my view. Because the marine protected areas are not chopped liver. There was a point to them, and maybe it would have been better in their balance. It sounds like from everything they could have done a better job in the Southern California ones, but I'm not willing to say that everywhere in the state of California has the same unfortunate issue that you feel aggrieved by. And so what I want is language that allows the state board to do its job, doesn't force us to put stricter regs on us, but it doesn't tie our hands if there are marine protected areas we should take note of. I'm very sympathetic to your concern, having been in your shoes, but I'm also sympathetic to not wanting to tie our hands if we need to, and I'm trying to figure out a way to give you the comfort you need in a stronger way than you feel you've had in the past without torquing the whole system or doing something disrespectful to a process that may not have worked out the way you would have wanted to, but is an incredibly important process, not just for California, but for the whole West Coast and in fact the world. So I don't want to denigrate it. But I think we're in the same place, but I want to figure out what is the most modest way possible to meet your concerns that's not going to have unintended consequences, either imagined or real.
I understand.
Yeah.
Mr. DiPoli, I know it seems like we're having a protracted issue here, but really what's happening is our staff is up draining Boca and Stampede reservoirs as we speak. So as soon as they give us the all clear signal, we'll get this resolved.
I have to say that I blame the two colleagues to my immediate left for this little crisis. If you will remember, I voted no against the resolution.
You said what?
I voted no against the resolution that took us down this path. So I should be excused from this torture.
Hey, you know, I was reading, based on the Surfrider representative's comment, the 5A3 seems like a pretty comforting bit of language for county sand. I don't know, that this, where a new SWQPA GP is established in the vicinity of an existing municipal wastewater outfall, there shall be no new or modified limiting condition or prohibitions for this area relative to those wastewater outfall. You know, there's some comfort language right there. I'm confused.
Very comforting, but it doesn't bind in any way an NPDES permit writer.
Well, we'll have another bite at the apple when we talk about designating these places. And maybe I'm just thinking out loud here, but perhaps, you know, your interest can, you're laying the groundwork for that, you know, public hearing at a later time.
So the only, you know, this may not be very helpful, but it's worth a try. I was listening to what Felicia Marcus was saying, and it seems to me that the concern that County Sand has is not on the designation of general protection area, but on the potential that an MPDS permit at some point would be written to say, based on the proximity of this MPA, we are requiring County Sand to go to tertiary treatment for all of its discharge. And first off, I think that it's pretty clear that that would be appealed to the state board, and that you would all have an opportunity to weigh in on that. But in addition, we could potentially put in some language in the resolve that said that you know, that the state board will be taking interest in you know, MPDS permit conditions that are related only to MPAs without the designation of a protected area in the interim, to provide some comfort that we would not just allow it to slip through without notice.